Matt? Okay. All right, let's have fun. Okay. Last week I went through the why you can't model an individual consumer as a utility maximising individual. This doesn't work as a model of human behaviour. But what I'm going to do today is actually assume that it does work. For a simple reason being that even if it did work, you can't go from a single consumer's demand curve to a market demand curve and have the same behaviour. And that's something which has been proven some time ago, that this is not possible. I've got the question marks there, but I'm going to show you in this lecture that it isn't possible to do that. So you can add up individual consumers, but you won't get a market demand curve that looks like the individual demand curve you can derive if you have the whole idea of fixing and compensated individual demand curves. So the key assumption in deriving the individual curve is that income doesn't change when you change prices. If you think about how you derive it, you start from the idea of a set of indifference curves between two commodities, or one commodity and all other commodities, and you change the relative price by pivoting the slope of the budget line without moving the point that shows you what you could consume if you bought all of everything else and none of that particular good. So your real income is remaining constant in terms of the other commodities as prices vary. But you can't assume that in general for the simple reason that prices determine incomes. If you think about varying the price of labour, then you're going to be varying the income of workers at the same time. And there's many other less direct commodities than that, but the same basic story applies. And it's a hallmark of neoclassical theory that changing prices changes incomes. So you do this in the individual, and notice that pivot point there doesn't move. That's saying your income doesn't change when you change relative prices. Now, we know that that's not the case in general. It's okay to do it for a single consumer because you can imagine that if you change the price of bananas and you've got one person and only one person, then the change in the price of bananas, unless you're a banana producer, won't have a major impact upon their income, so it's okay there. But when you start talking about more than one consumer, you're talking about an economy, then prices are one of the two key sources of income, the other being the quantity you sell. So changing relative prices will change the distribution of income, and therefore will have impact on some consumers more than others. So with that problem, the budget constraint doesn't necessarily stay still. The point which you pivot, the individual, can't be assumed to stay in the same fixed point when you look at more than one consumer. So it's an intellectual problem. Is it possible to take account of this and say that changing prices will change incomes and still derive the result that you get a downward sloping market demand curve? Now, that's the problem that a range of top-notch neoclassical economists gave themselves to solve back between the 1950s and the 1970s. The third guy in that, or the fourth guy in that list, got a Nobel Prize for mathematical economics. So we're not talking lightweights here in terms of neoclassical theory, we're talking top-of-the-range people. So here they set themselves this problem. Under what conditions will a market demand curve have the same properties we've proven apply for an individual demand curve, where the key property is this so-called law of demand, that if you increase the price of something, demand for it will drop. And it's called the Sonnenschein-Mantel-Debreu conditions, because those are the names of the three economists whose research in the 1970s reproved this problem. But in fact, the first person to do it was the first guy named there, Gorman. Now, to give you an idea how long this idea has been known, this was proven first in 1953. So it should have been something you learned about, something I learned about, but I was 0 years old at that stage. Okay, it should have turned up when I was 18, sitting in the same situation you are now. So what we started from is as I showed you in the first week, is the law of demand applies to what are called Hicksian compensated individual demand curves, that if you reduce price for a product, demand will necessarily rise. And what I'm going to show you now, that's not true for a market demand curve. So this is the way that Sonnenschein described it in 1972. And he said, we prove that every polynomial is an excess demand function for a specified commodity in some n commodity economy, meaning an economy with more than one good in it. Okay? Now, what does it mean by that? Well, a polynomial is a function like a plus bx plus cx squared plus dx cubed, etc., etc., where x in this particular case is the quantity being consumed of something. And that's then describing the price. So it says you can use any polynomial you like, and that can be the description of a market demand in some particular market in that economy. Now, a polynomial will describe any function that's continuous, that doesn't return more than one value for one input, so you can't get two values of price for one value of quantity, and it can't loop back on itself. But apart from that, anything you can draw with a squiggly line without taking a finger off the page can be a demand curve. And that was proven back in 1972. So the downward sloping market demand curve you see in your textbooks is an exception. If it exists, it's not the rule. So it means you can't even study a single market as if it has a downward sloping market demand curve. And that's even though we're summing individual demand curves that look like this. So imagine you've got Robinson Crusoe and Man Friday on their island looking at the demand for coconuts. They've both got downward sloping individual demand curves for coconuts. You add them up and you get a demand curve for coconuts that look like that. And that's exactly what these theorems argue. Now what I see this theorem is, and this is not how it was done, is what's called proof by contradiction. Has anybody heard that term before? Proof by contradiction? Never heard it? Nobody? Okay. It shows how little mathematics you get these days. Most critics of economic thinking do too much mathematics. I reckon you don't do enough, because this should be something you already know. And what you do with proof by contradiction is you assume something to be true, and then you work through your logic and you contradict one of the assumptions you made to get that proposition to be true, and that therefore shows the proposition is in fact false. So in effect what these people did, and I think really without being conscious they were doing it, they assumed that market demand curves do obey the law of demand. And then they worked out what the conditions were for that to be true. And those conditions contradicted the starting point of saying we can aggregate different consumers with different commodities and get a downward sloping market demand curve. Now, that's not what they found they did. They're not how they expressed it. A colleague of mine, who's actually a professor of mathematics at a leading Canadian university, is now intending to write a book which rewrites these theorems and shows they actually are proof by contradiction. That'll take a while, but this is the basic idea. So what proof by contradiction is it's a really ancient, like 2,500 years old, way of proving something to be false. Unless you assume it's true, and then work through your logic and find you contradict yourself. So for example, we all know the square root of 2 is an irrational number. And that means a number you can't describe as a ratio of two integers to each other. Okay? It cannot be described that way. But this wasn't known to the ancient Pythagoreans. They thought that all numbers were describable as a ratio of two integers. Okay? Now, this is actually proved using geometry when it was first proven, and it was about the square root of 5, not the square root of 2, because that was to do with the ratio of the shape of pentagons. The way they work was mainly with geometric shapes. They drew a pentagon, and you draw another pentagon inside that, and then another pentagon inside that, all based on the previous pentagon. And they proved there was no pair of numbers that those ratios converged to. Okay? So that was the way proof was actually found. But I'll take you through the square root of 2. So let's actually, we don't know whether it's a rational number or an irrational number. So we're going to assume that it's rational and see what happens. And we'll find a contradiction. So if the square root of 2 is a rational number, then there have to be two numbers, A and B, that are the smallest numbers for which that statement is true. You could find, if that number happened to be 22 and 7, for example, then 44 and 14 would also be a pair of numbers where that were true. But 22 and 7 are the smallest numbers that only have 1 in themselves as common factors. So 22 and 7, the only thing you can divide 22 and 7 by is 1. Okay? So that's the idea. So A and B are the smallest numbers for which this proposition is true. Well, if that is true, we start from that position. So A and B might be 22 and 7. there are no common factors apart from 1, and they are equal to the ratio the square root of 2. Okay, that's where we start from. What you can do first of all, the obvious thing to do is square both sides. Now you can say a squared over b squared is equal to 2. Simple mathematical logic. And rearrange that. You're going to say a squared is equal to 2 times b squared. Now, what does that tell us about a? Is a an even number or an odd number? Okay. It has to be an even number, because if you square an odd number, you get another odd number. 3 squared is 9. Okay. 5 squared is 25, etc., etc. So you know that a has to be an even number, because when you square it, you get an even number. Therefore, a itself has to be even. So I can now substitute and say, well, a has to be 2 times some other integer, which could be odd or even. So that therefore means that a is going to be equal to 2 times some other number, which we're going to label c. Okay? So we can now say a is 2 times c. So a squared is 2 times c squared, which is 2 times c all squared, which is 4 times c squared. With me so far? Okay. Well, we already know, we can substitute that in the top equation where we say a squared is 2 times b squared. We're now proven that a squared, which is 2 times b squared, is also equal to 4 times c squared. So what do we now know about b? B is an even number. So b also has 2 as a common factor. Now I started off by assuming that a and b only have 1 as a common factor. I've now proven that if the square root of 2 is a rational number, then they must have 2 as a common factor as well, which contradicts my starting assumption. So you've proven by contradiction that the square root of 2 cannot be a rational number. Okay? That's the way it works. It's a very simple but very powerful mathematical proof. So in effect, what's happened with this Sonnenschein-Mandel-Debreu condition is much the same sort of idea. They started off by assuming that the law of demand applied to a market economy, and then proved the conditions under which that applied contradicted the starting assumptions of different consumers consuming different products. And the only way they could get out of it was by assuming there was a single consumer consuming a single product, which contradicts the starting point. That's the way to look at this whole thing. By the way, what do you think happened to the Pythagorean? There's obviously some individual human being first discovered that the square root of there were numbers which were not rational. And the Pythagoreans had as a unifying belief when they began that all numbers could be expressed as a ratio of 2 integers. What do you think happened to the person who discovered it? Pardon? They drowned him. Poor bastard was on a boat in the Mediterranean when he first worked it out. Incredible consternation. What the result was, chuck him overboard. Now, of course, at a later stage, they integrated the whole idea, and you then got irrational numbers being recognised by mathematicians. So the growth of all the theories about quadratics, etc., etc. And then we moved on beyond that in the middle of the last millennium to talk about complex numbers, which are numbers involving the square root of -1. And without all those mathematical advances, you and I would still be sitting in a cave somewhere. It wouldn't be neon light. So that's phenomenal progress by admitting that a starting position was wrong. Now, what neoclassical economists did instead, I think, was bury the result. They proved that you couldn't get a rational market demand curve by adding up rational consumers. But their reaction to it was to say, let's pretend that we didn't discover that, or let's pretend that we were successful. And we proved that markets had the same shape, market demand curves had the same shape as individual demand curves. So this is a very sick piece of logic I'm going to take you through. What economists did was a great advance, but the way they reacted to it was the opposite of scientific behaviour. So the way you work with the individual is you start with the idea of a well-behaved utility function for some consumer. So has all the properties we know from last week that it doesn't have, but you can derive that down the sloping demand curve, which involves the consumer, because they're getting to a higher utility level, having both an income effect and a substitution effect. And you start, of course, with this assumption that you can vary that pivot point without changing. When you change the relative prices, you don't change that pivot point up there. And then, of course, you can compensate for the income effect. So you can then move all those curves back so they're tangential to the one utility curve, and then have a downward sloping Hicksian demand curve, which necessarily obeys the law of demand. That's what you can do for an individual. So what the SMD research is saying, does this result survive aggregation, even though we know now that that pivot point moves? And the answer was no. So we start with arguing that prices will change the distribution of income. And now we've got to set up our assumptions, first of all. So we are now assuming that the result is we will get to this point, but we have to prove it by starting with consumers and products where there's more than one consumer and more than one product. But to have more than one consumer, consumers have to have different sources of income. You can't all have the same source of income. And you have to have different tastes. You can't all feel exactly the same way about every commodity. Oh, good God. Hang on a second, pardon me. Hang on a second. Bloody hell, Gonzalo. I am in another lecture. Bugger off. This will turn up on the website. Okay. One of the hassles about being involved with people all around the world, I get communications coming in at ridiculous hours from all over the place. This guy's corresponding with us from France right now, so pardon me. Boom. Okay. That's going to go down well on the website. Okay. Okay, so you've got to have different income sources and different consumption tastes. Otherwise, you've only got one consumer. But another little trick that is actually rather more subtle is tastes have to change with income as well. Because if tastes don't change with income, there's only one commodity. Now, I'll give you a very crude example of that. Imagine that at a, oh, pardon me, wrong bloody button, I'm doing well here. It's going to be a mess when I put it up on the web, but anyway. Okay. Pardon me, okay, here. Just imagine that on an income level of $100 a week, you consume one pizza and you go through one roll of toilet paper a week. Okay. If your income becomes $100 million a week, then you would be consuming, if you didn't have difference in tastes, you'd be consuming 100 pizzas, a million pizzas and a million toilet rolls. That ain't going to happen, is it? Okay? The relative ratio in which you consume different goods will vary as your income rises. So if it doesn't vary, there's only one commodity. So those are the conditions to give you two different consumers with two different commodities. Now let's imagine a world with two consumers and two commodities. And the simplest thing, Robinson Crusoe and Man Friday, consuming coconuts and bananas, the sort of stuff you'd find on a desert island. And I'm going to assume that Crusoe owns all the bananas, banana trees, all the bananas, and Friday all the coconuts. I'm not even looking at production here, by the way. We're not looking at having to produce bananas or produce, there's just a set number of them. I'm not even bringing in the complications that come from different productions and marginal cost, all that sort of stuff. Just an absolute endowment of these commodities in the first instance. Can we get a market demand curve that looks like the individual one? Now, to make the goods different, again, I'm going to have coconuts being a necessity and bananas a luxury. So as your income rises, you tend to consume bananas more than you would consume coconuts. But I'm also going to have Friday having a higher preference for coconuts than Crusoe. So Crusoe's more inclined to be the bon vivant and eat the expensive stuff. Okay, so there's difference in tastes, different in income sources, and the commodities themselves differ as well. And we start with some arbitrary price ratio. You've got to start somewhere. So I'm going to draw Crusoe's indifference curves in. The same slope budget line applies to both of them. The actual pivot point will be different because their incomes will be different with that price level. So that's putting a price on coconuts and a price on bananas. But we start from that point, and then I consider a lower price for bananas. So therefore I make the curve flatter. Now where do I place it? Well, Crusoe, who's the one who sells the bananas, his income is going to fall. So the price of bananas is going to be lower. Friday, on the other hand, relative, in terms of absolute income, will rise. He can now buy more bananas using the coconuts he owns. So his income has risen. Now what's going to happen to demand for bananas? Well, the normal argument, by dropping the price, demand should rise. But the market demand could fall because the person who produces them is now earning less income, so Crusoe is going to fall, and the person whose income has risen doesn't like bananas that much. So you can't say which way it's going to go. It could go up, could go down. Therefore, you don't have the necessary decline or increase in demand from the decline in price. Now that's the price variation part of the whole procedure. What about varying income? Well, with the Hicksian idea of doing a Hicksian compensated demand curve, you keep relative prices constant and you increase the incomes equally. Okay, so here we have Crusoe and we have Friday, and there's our initial budget line, and I'm going to keep the budget line constant, but I'm going to move it out now. The question is, how far do I move it out? Well, if you increase income evenly, bananas are the luxury. So society in general is going to want to have more bananas relative to coconuts. This is like increasing the number of bananas and coconuts on the island now. So I've shipped in, the bananas and coconuts from a neighbouring island in the same ratio that they were initially on the first island. Well, as a result, I'm going to make Crusoe better off, because now there's more bananas. The demand for bananas will rise more than the demand for coconuts. So I can't compensate for the income effect because of that variation in the classification of the goods. A uniform increase in income improves the income of the person producing the luxury more than it does the person producing the necessity. So you can't evenly compensate for income that way either. So that leads to the result that if you try to derive a demand curve, you're going to get all sorts. First of all, you can't get rid of the income effect, and secondly, the effect of price changes will not be predictable. It'll be up, it'll be down, all over the place. It won't be a one-way direction. So you don't get the law of demand. And the only way you can avoid it is by assuming that consumers all have identical tastes. Therefore, it doesn't matter whether you get the money to Crusoe or Friday, or both spend it the same way, but that's the same as having only one consumer. And you have to assume that tastes don't change with income as well. Because if tastes do change with income, then you benefit the luxury producer. Now, the only way that you won't have any change in the ratio in which things are consumed as income rises is if there's only one commodity. So I've contradicted the starting point of two consumers with different tastes consuming two different commodities. We're back to the stage where we can prove that, yes, you get a downward sloping market demand curve if there's one consumer consuming one product. So you know by proof by contradiction that the law of demand doesn't apply to a market demand curve. It can have any shape at all. It can go up, it can go down. That's the theorem. Now, if that's the way neoclassicals expressed it, I wouldn't be bothering telling you this because we wouldn't be learning supply and demand theory. It would have gone out the window 50 years ago, 60 years ago. What they actually do is they describe the conditions for what I've shown the contradiction. They call them stringent conditions. They say that if stringent conditions apply, then you can aggregate. And therefore you get the law of demand for not just individual markets, but also for the entire economy. So this is how they put it. The law of demand will obey, the market demand curve will obey the law of demand when preferences are homothetic. Now that sounds really complex. Use a Latin word if you want to intimidate somebody, okay? Homothetic means straight lines. Okay? It simply means your tastes don't change with income. And secondly, distribution of income, and also the value of wealth, because they weren't talking about production there, they were talking about initial endowments, that even failed at that level, is independent of prices. That contradicts neoclassical theory. And Gorman, I love this one. Gorman says you can get a downward sloping market demand curve if and only if. It's not a mathematical expression. It says that is an absolutely essential condition. If these angle curves are parallel straight lines, then you can get a downward sloping market demand curve. If they're not, then you can't. So it's an absolute condition. You remember what angle curves are? They're a curve that's supposed to represent how your consumption changes as you change the level of income. So it's the whole idea of shifting out the demand curve, the income level. Now there's three possible types of commodities. A luxury, where you consume more as your income rises. A necessity, where you consume relatively less but still having a rising consumption level. So, you know, if you do go from $100 a week to $1 million, you are likely to buy more toilet rolls. And a giffen good, where you can absolutely drop the consumption level. So the higher income level, the less spam you consume, unless you're studying economics. So graphically, this is what it looks like. There's a necessity. Consumption falling relatively as your income rises. Here's a luxury. Consumption rising relatively as your income rises. And here's an inferior good. It actually bends backwards. Now, what is a homothetic? It's none of the above. Can't be any of those. All it can be is this. Okay. Now that's unfortunately ridiculous, as we know. That those are ratios. It talks about marginal ratios, but it starts from zero, which I'll come back to later. But if you actually consume that at $100 a day, then you'd be consuming 100 pieces, you know, a day if you made $10,000 a day. It's nonsense. It's not a stringent condition. It's nonsense. And it's not as bad. It gets worse than that, because as well as it having to be a straight line, it has to be parallel to everybody else's. So here's Joe Bloggs. Those are that's his angle curves. Here's Bill Gates. He's got to have the same angles curve, parallel. And it's even worse than that. And this is where you read this stuff and you really think, you know, what the hell were you smoking when you wrote this paper? Gorman says they have to be parallel straight lines for different individuals at the same prices. But one thing you learn in mathematics is a simple little condition, which is parallel lines that pass through the same point are the same line. That's one of the essential propositions in Euclid's geometry. Because we're talking about consumers consuming out of income, all Engels curves pass through 0, 0. If you earn 0 income, you can consume 0 bananas and 0 coconuts. Therefore, they're all the same straight line. It isn't just parallel, they've got to be identical. So you have to have all consumers have to be describable using this and only this, for example, this particular example here, set of Engels curves. Nothing else is possible. So what that means is we have all individuals having the same preferences, which means there's only one individual. Anybody here seen The Life of Brian? A few, you know The Life of Brian side with the we are all individuals scene, yeah? And if you don't change your income, then there's only one commodity. That's not stringent conditions, that's proof by contradiction that you can't get a downwardly sloping market demand curve. So, having done an accidental proof by contradiction, what we should have out of that is this should have been thrown in the garbage bin. The idea you can go from a downward sloping individual demand curve to a downward sloping market demand curve should have been admitted to be false, in the same way that showing that, you know, drawing a right angled triangle where both sides are 1 and finding that the hypotenuse is necessarily an irrational number. We've done exactly the same sort of thing here by showing you have so-called rational consumers, the aggregation of which gives you an irrational demand curve. And they should have accepted that. We would have been a much richer economics if we'd actually done it and realised that this is what happens. There's your individual demand curve, aggregate, and there's your market demand curve. Because if you do that, then you can't do supply and demand analysis, because if that's your demand curve, without even taking into account the income effects of production turning up there, then where's your intersection going to be with the demand and supply curve? Assuming you can draw one, which I'll show you shortly you can't. So the analysis just goes completely out the window. We have to find something other than the Marshallian theory. And in macroeconomics, the last thing you'd want to do is model the entire economy as a single individual. Now, you haven't yet done this. They reserve this treat for honours and PhD programs. But you all done ICE element analysis and aggregate to aggregate demand? If you do the honours level, they'll teach you what they call dynamic, stochastic, general equilibrium, real business cycle models. And they model the entire economy as a single utility maximising agent. They've reduced macro to micro in the belief that micro is consistent all the way through with macro, which it's not. So what you could do, and this is the only sensible reaction I've seen to this hypothesis from a person who was once a neoclassical economist, he said you simply can't work from the individual level. He said we may be forced to if we're going to progress where we got to, we may be forced to reason in terms of groups with collectively coherent behaviour. And that's exactly what the preceding classical school of economics did. It talked about workers and capitalists, financiers, rentiers, landlords, etc., and talked about interactions between those social classes. Ironically, what the neoclassicals have proven is that that's where you should be doing economics, at the level of social classes, not at the level of isolated individuals. But they still haven't realised it. This is Alan Kerman writing back in 1989. I imagine most people in the classroom are born after that, correct? Fair few before. We're talking an evening class here. But that's the reality. That's what should have been communicated to you. I should have learnt this when I was at university, in your age, which anything but was what happened. Because this is what they instead say. Now, this is a good start, by the way. Notice the title of the book, A Handbook of Mathematical Economics, Volume 2. It's a 3-volume set put together by some of the most authoritative neoclassical economists on the planet. Only neoclassical economists got asked to contribute chapters. And these two guys were asked to write the chapter on demand and aggregation. And they started off with an extremely direct statement. Market demand functions need not satisfy in any way the classical restriction which characterised consumer demand functions. That restriction being the law of demand. And they said, now this is where they start to go wonky, and you can actually see people misreading this and thinking they can get away with special assumptions. Strong restrictions are needed to justify the hypothesis that the market demand curve has the characteristics of a consumer demand function, but only in special cases. Well, the special cases, for example, like in mathematics, that there is no such thing as irrational numbers. Now, if we had that, I'm not joking, we'd still be sitting, we'd be sitting in marble seats in Plato's Republic. We wouldn't have any of the technology we've got now if the mathematicians behave this way. The punchline, we can get nothing out of utility maximising behaviour unless we add in other assumptions, which is what they've done. Now, that's a relatively honest statement of the dilemma. It's far worse when you look at the textbook, and this is the postgraduate book that used to dominate instruction by neoclassical economists until about 10 to 15 years ago. A guy called Haldarian wrote this one, and he says it is sometimes convenient to think of aggregate demand as the demand of some representative consumer. Notice this, the conditions under which this can be done are stringent, but a discussion is beyond the scope of this book. In other words, hold my hand and trust me, I'll lead you through the forest. Okay. And I really love I read these books very carefully. There's one amusing thing, there's a guy called, what's his name, Nick Rowe, I think, who wrote a blog post just recently sort of saying, look, all you critics of neoclassical economics out there, why don't you go and read the neoclassical textbook? Go on, have a look, see what we actually believe. You'll see there's a lot of sense in it. I could stack them high to this room, the number that I've read. The textbook, let alone reading the research papers. But here's reading the second and third edition of Variant. In the second edition, when explaining this whole how to get around the problem, it says this demand function can be rationalised by a representative consumer. Now, even though the word rational is a positive word, rationalise, use it in friends, talking to friends, saying, oh, that's just a rationalisation. You come up with a silly idea to get over an objection I've made. So rationalise is a negative word. He rewrote for the third edition. Look what he used instead. Generated. Now, generated sounds much more scientific and mathematical, doesn't it? That's the extent to which they're going to bury this result. He clearly knows the result. He's trying to hide it. Now, undergraduate texts are worse again because often they don't know the result and they simply think you can add up demand curves horizontally without realising that to get the demand curve in the first place, you've got to vary relative prices. And when you vary relative prices with more than one person, you change incomes. So they don't realise they've left out the step of going from indifference curves to demand curves. So I think just add up the demand curves without realising to do that, they've got to vary the indifference curve budget lines as well. So here's a couple of the textbooks. This is in Sloman and Norris, so we used to use, I think we might still use it here. The demand curve is arrived at by adding up total demand of all consumers in the market for any given price, without realising the impact of changing price on changing incomes. So no mention of the problem there at all. My favourite is Paul Samuelson, and this is again one of these areas where reading the text took me backwards further on in the literature. So in the 2010 edition, the 19th edition of the book, by the way, he says the market demand curve is found by adding up quantities demanded, same thing as Sloman and Norris. But then he asks, does it obey the law of downward sloping demand? It certainly does. Nice and authoritative, okay? And he then gives a couple of examples about price reductions and income and substitution effects. Now, that's a provably false statement, as I've shown you beforehand. But the funny thing is, Samuelson actually thought he'd proven that it was okay. And this, if I had to nominate the most absurd published research paper in economic theory, I'd probably give this one, this would be in my top 10, probably top 3. Because he started off by admitting the problem. He was writing this, he read this paper after Gorman, he clearly read Gorman's paper. And what Gorman did was try to use what he called community indifference loci, as he called them, to describe the tastes of an individual country. And so Samuel's looking at that particular proof, which is less elaborate than the one that Sun and Shine and Manchel and De Breu did about 20 years later. But he said, what defence can we use for imagining you can describe an entire country's preferences using a set of utility curves that obey revealed preference? He says, well, you can claim that the country is inhabited by identical individuals with identical tastes. We're also with initial endowments, exactly the conditions I've shown you today. So he's stating, yes, it's a problem. And he says, well, they're not very realistic, but maybe better than just Robinson Crusoe alone. No, it's not. If you assume Robinson Crusoe and Man Friday are identical and both have the same distributions of coconuts and bananas, that's more stupid than even imagining Tom Hanks on an island with his own, talking to his, what did he have in that movie? It was a basketball. Yeah, basketball. Was it basketball? Yeah. Okay. But then he says, well, you can't even do it for families. If you add up family, people in the family are going to have different tastes. But then he says, but blood is thicker than water. So the preferences of the members of the family, you can say, are related by a consensus, a social welfare function, which takes into account how deserved each member of the family is. And then the family acts as one unit, maximising a joint utility function. So I've now aggregated from individuals to a family. Now, I happen to come from a pretty happy family, okay? But I know people who don't. So we now have a happy family theory of economics. But it gets better than that. He then says the entire economy is one big happy family. Now read those words. The same argument will apply to all of society if optimal reallocations of income can be assumed to keep the worth of each person's marginal dollar equal. In other words, we assume that before anything happens in trade, we all shuffle the money around, so we're all extremely happy with the current distribution of income. So I assume you're all quite happy with the amount of money Donald Trump gets, correct? Did you all agree on the pay rate for Kevin Rudd and Julia Gillard? It's sheer bloody nonsense. But then having said that, he then says we now have a rigorous proof. Rigorous? Any mathematician, if you're making assumptions like that, would be thrown out of the department. A rigorous proof is given that these indifference contracts have exactly the same properties as ordinary ones, blah, 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 writing back in 56, 3 years after Gorman's result. So he glosses over Gorman completely. And he's trying to convince us we can imagine that America is one big happy family. Now, I'm sorry, but what the hell is he smoking? How can anybody believe that? I mean, he's either a zombie or he's stoned. One or the other. But that is now repeated in PhD textbooks. I mentioned that Varian was the dominant book for PhD and honours instruction. I think it's still used for honours here until about 15 years ago. The new kingpin is being by a guy called Mas Khalil, called Macroeconomic Theory. It's got a few other authors, but he's the lead author. And he then asked, under what conditions can we aggregate and do the welfare comparisons? And he says, well, that's when we have a fictional individual whose preferences happen to match the entire society. But on top of that, we have to all agree that that person's judgments accurately describe how we think income should be distributed. So we're all absolutely happy about the current distribution of income. You wouldn't want to take $1 away from anybody else and give it to yourself because you think you're more deserving than they are. Nobody feels that way. Whole of society. And how do we get to that position? Well, it's simple. We just imagine that there's some benevolent dictator, pardon me, central authority, who redistributes all incomes to maximise social welfare. And given that assumption, we can get a downward sloping market demand curve. So he's willing to assume that Joseph Stalin runs the place, and Joseph likes everybody, and everybody likes Joseph, to get a downward sloping market demand curve. It is truly tragic that that's...
What alternative there?
Pardon?
What alternative?
Going back to classical economics. The crazy thing is neoclassical economics evolved as a way of attacking the classical school, and there's good reasons to attack parts of what the classical school did. I'm a critic of labour theory of value, for example, which is part of Marx's rendition of classical economics. But they worked in terms of social classes, they had social conflict going on, workers versus capitalists, financial capital versus industrial capital, landlords versus capitalists versus workers, etc., etc. So they saw social conflict ruling and they worked at this aggregate level. And what the neoclassical said, oh, that's all messy and silly and we don't need to work in terms of social classes, we should work in terms of utility maximising individuals. Well, ironically, what they've proven is, no, the classicals were right. You should work at that level.
Do they actually believe you can aggregate, or they say you can't really aggregate, but the best tool is just the tool to do something?
Pretty much the latter. I think you're right. When you talk to people who know this theorem, and I'd say in conventional academic economic circles, I'd be guessing that maybe 10 to 15% know the condition. The vast majority don't even learn that it's there. But of that minority who do, the reaction will say, look, it's just a set of conditions. We know it's not quite right, but we have to aggregate somehow. And you've got to make a few assumptions to reach a model. So they say, it's just one of those things where the assumptions, you know, they're a bit awkward, but hey, we need the model, and this is the only way we can do it.
Is that reaching is used by them?
Pardon?
Is that reaching is used by them now? We can't get used.
It's used by date with the day it was discovered. Because what we should have done is say, well, we therefore can't aggregate up to individuals. We can't use, we could actually work from individuals. We then have to get conflict. We can't imagine that everybody agrees. We're going to get demand curves that don't look like, you know, don't have a shape. Let's just do supply and demand analysis. And that would have actually stuck with economics back. It happened back in the 1950s. It predates computers. So if you wanted to actually model it from the individual up, you realise you couldn't get through this barrier of aggregation. But you wanted to do, economics is supposed to be about the aggregate behaviour. So at that stage, you imagine people saying, well, we have to do it. We don't like it. We have to do it because we simply, nobody's invented computers yet. You know, like the computers were invented in 1940, 41. The first computer was used to crack the code that the German submarines used to communicate their commands to each other. So I think it was called the Enigma machine. So by the time 1953 occurred, when Gorman found this result, there would have been less than 100 computers worldwide, or even less than 10. So back then it would have been a real block. Now you could say we've got programs like NetLogo, we can simulate it, we can aggregate up, let's go ahead and do it. Pardon? Yeah, Facebook. Yeah, the technology is out there. I mean, did anybody play that game called, was it Virtual Life? That's not a hand going up, somebody's scratching himself, okay. What's it called? There's Second Life. Anybody played Second Life? Oh, there's actually another, if you look on the web, you'll find a program, a website program called Second Life, where you can actually a whole economy. And people actually use real money to buy goods in the virtual world of Second Life. And there's a good friend and colleague of mine, Yanis Varoufakis, who, has anybody heard the name before, Yanis Varoufakis? Okay, look him up on the web. He blogs on his Greek, and he blogs on Greece. And he's just recently got a position where he now manages a software company's virtual world that has 15 million people in it. And he's doing economic research using this virtual world. So these days we could do it. Back then, we couldn't. So you can imagine back then saying, yeah, don't like the assumption, we're stuck with it, because the only way you can model is by going from the bottom up.
But then I imagine you need a consensus of a lot of people to say this is an alternative. Is there a movement for that?
Yeah, there is some part of it. Let's say we've got a model from the tops down. And we could have done the top down decades ago, because the modelling techniques to handle aggregating and working with social classes and doing the dynamics was being known for about 140 years.
So what does that model look like?
I'll show you in 5 weeks' time. Okay. Back to this one. So we've got this, I agree, it's a good point though. At the time it happened, it was valid to say, well, given how economics has always worked from the individual up, not always. When the classical school was abandoned, the neoclassical said, we've got to work from individuals up. Given the fact we can't get there, let's wait for a while until we can and then do it, and then we'll find, the complexity will reveal the complexity, but they haven't done it. They could do it now. Most of my colleagues who are neoclassical, they could learn how to program a NetLogo. They could be generating it. They're not. The only critics like myself do that sort of work still. So it is quite insane. So here's another one. Exactly the same idea. Just do the horizontal sum. No awareness of the problem itself. That's unfortunately where we are. So most of them don't know the problem. I'd really like to take a poll and find out how many did. I've got a feeling it's at the order of 10 to 20%. Or they interpret it in this absolutely bizarre way. Now here's Gorman back in 1953, when he worked out the utility function that could let him do the aggregation, which is, of course, everybody's the same as everybody else and all goods are the same as well. He said the necessary and sufficient conditions are intuitively reasonable. It says in effect that an extra unit of purchasing power should be spent in the same way no matter to whom is it given. If you imagine you're walking along through Central Railway Station and you throw a couple of dollars into the begging bowl of a derelict, the derelict's going to spend the $2 the same way you are going to? I don't think so. He says it's intuitively reasonable. Just unbelievable. Or they teach the entire economy as though it's a single agent, and again, Varian once more. He was saying, again, the way this is described is so mendacious. Not quite lying, but said in such a way that the untruth is communicated rather than the truth. There's the aggregate demand function will in general possess no interesting properties. Now, looking at that as a novice from the outside, you might think interesting means, oh, therefore it's got the same boring shape that the individual demand curve has, slopes down. Oh, okay, good. You don't really interesting means it doesn't have the properties we want it to have. If you use the word desirable properties from the point of view of the theory, that would have been a more honest way of stating it. But then he says, unless we assume that individuals have the Gorman form, and then we can do this rationalize, which of course later becomes generated by a representative agent. And that's why we've got to the stage now where they model the entire economy as a single agent, what's called real business cycle theory, which began this trend of subsuming macroeconomics as a branch of applied micro, actually began by having a single consumer utility, maximizing utility being the demand side of the economy, and the same consumer working as a worker, providing labour into the same economy, and the same consumer being the owner of the firm, earning profits and deciding how much to invest. That's macroeconomics. Okay. The new Keynesian crowd, who are much more sophisticated, have two people doing it instead, if you're lucky. So here's Alan Kerman giving a rather complicated proof of why you can't get an aggregate consumer who's the same as two individuals. So I'll just put that one over there, screen by screen. Take a look at it yourself later if you like on the web. It's a complicated example. I hope mine's a bit clearer. Much the same idea as Alan's, but doing a bit more slowly. So here we have all other goods and versus bananas, and two consumers, red and blue. And I'm giving the same relative price line for the two of them and the same budget. So I'm just looking at the incomes are the same here. And there's the amount that, given that budget and that price line, the red consumer consumes at point R1 and the blue consumer consumes at point B1. So we know that the blue consumer prefers B1 to R1. Okay? We know the red consumer prefers R1 to B1. We know they differ like that to begin with. So I've got different consumers, different tastes. Different income pattern. Here's R2, there's B2. Now, looking at the way I've drawn that, notice that red's gone to a lower indifference curve now, whereas blue's gone to a higher one. So we know that the red consumer prefers 1 to 2, and the blue consumer prefers 2 to 1. Now, to add them up, I'm going to push the income curve out, adding the two incomes together. And I'm going to look at the two relative prices as well. And using triangulation, I'm going to add up and work out what amount would be consumed, adding the two together, R1 plus B1 and R2 plus B2. So I now get two new points on this aggregate curve, and this aggregate agent, therefore, represents the entire economy. But how will these represent R1 and red and blue? Well, there's RA1, the first point, and there's RA2, and we can see that the utility is higher for the second instance. Now we know the red agent prefers trolley 1 to trolley 2, the blue prefers trolley 2 to trolley 1, the composite agent prefers 2 to 1 as well, which agrees with B, but contradicts A. So you can't get that composite agent as soon as people differ in their tastes, just using the geometric analysis of neoclassical theory. But what the theory does when you get to macro these days is they treat the entire economy as a single agent. Or even if they do take two agents into account, they don't then make one a capitalist and the other a worker, look at income distribution effects of wage rates versus changing profit rates and prices and markups and so on. So we have a real mess. First of all, as I showed you last week, individuals can't be utility maximizers. It's impossible. People can't calculate as rapidly as is necessary, except in the toy model of a two-dimensional diagram. And even if they did, as I've shown you now, the market demand curve won't slope downwards, any slope at all. So what about the supply curve? Well, I'm going to show you in the next lecture that doesn't do very well either when you take a good look at it. But I'll take you through the conventional explanation of the model. And this is Mancu's, the animation that if anybody buys Mancu's text to teach, they get the right to use these graphics that are supplied with the textbook for the lecturer. And what often happens in this case is not Mancu who does the slides, somebody else does them. And whoever they got to do them is an amateur in terms of how the presentations are done, but I'll take you through it. Maximize profits. Notice the whole idea of the firm is trying to maximize profits. And I'm going to show you shortly that neoclassical economists can't play darts. So that's supposed to be the goal of the firm. And then we're told monopoly is these conditions: a sole producer with a downward sloping market demand curve, a price maker, and it will reduce price to increase sales, whereas what we want is a competitive firm, one of many with a horizontal demand curve, price taker, sells as much or a little at the same price, so no change in price for a change in its output. Competitive firms, just like monopolies, are trying to maximize profits. And the way they do it is by equating marginal cost and price, because their price is equal to marginal revenue. They change their output, it has no effect on their price. So therefore, their supply curve, let's go back up again and remind you of that one. Their supply curve is the marginal cost curve. And that's essential, as I'll show you later the theory to hold together. So, you sell, it's showing why you equate profits where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. And here's a competitive firm. It'll make those profits. With you compare a competitive firm to a monopoly, you've got horizontal demand curve for the competitive firm versus a downward sloping for the monopolist. And a monopolist will always, I put terrible animations there. The monopolist will make a profit by equating marginal cost and marginal revenue and then setting the price at the higher level, and therefore makes additional profits. And there we go. And therefore there's a welfare loss due to monopoly. Remember all that stuff from first year? Okay, it's all garbage. I'll show you why in the next half of the lecture. Let's take a little
Now go away or I shall taunt you a second time.
Come back in a few minutes, we'll go through the rest of it.